Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Chris Bryant, CCI number 12933, and this is video 20, Cisco Home Lab Help. And this is a bonus video, compliments of the Bryant Advantage and Train Signal. This video does not contain information that you need to pass the BSCI exam, but it does contain information that will help you do so. Even if you don't think you want your own home lab, you really should invest the time to watch this video. It will be worth your while, I promise you that. I want to give you a quick disclaimer right off the top. I do not sell Cisco equipment. This is not a pitch for you to buy Cisco routers and switches from the Bryant Advantage because I don't sell them. The same goes for Train Signal. We've both been very successful in our training endeavors. I'm busier than heck, and I'm thrilled about that how well my courses have gone over. So I have no plans whatsoever to extend into selling Cisco hardware. I leave that for other people. And we're going to have a discussion here about why to put together your own home lab, what models you should look at. And throughout this discussion, I am not going to recommend any specific vendors. I do have a few that I like to deal with, but that's for another time. And the one company I will mention here is eBay, simply because it's a good place to go out and get information. Because the biggest hesitancy I see out there with CCNA candidates and CCNP candidates is just it's a little nerve-wracking. You can get nervous because you're thinking, what do I need to buy? I don't want to buy anything and get stuck with it, and it's not what I need, and maybe I don't want to do this, and you just kind of talk yourself out of it. There's no shame in that if you've done that. I've seen plenty of people do it. But the key is you got to get your hands on the equipment to really become a true professional at it. And putting together your own home lab is easier than ever. It's more affordable than ever. I think that I've had a lot to do with people moving to home labs because I've written a lot of articles on the web regarding that, and I'll mention that later in this course about where you can find those. And I will mention to you when perhaps you should consider renting remote access to a Cisco pod. Another disclaimer, I do that as a service. I do rent remote access, but considering that 99% of this particular video is going to be telling you the benefits of buying your own stuff, I'm kind of taking money out of my own pocket there. But I think those of you who have rented equipment from me in the past can vouch for the fact that it's very affordable. I'm not getting rich off that. It's more of a service for people who just don't have access to equipment otherwise. And then finally, we'll take a look at the routing setup. The physical setup, that is, that we used to create this video, that I used to develop this course. And if you choose to rent rack time from me in the future, you can actually see the physical topology, and it will give you some good ideas as to what you can set up. So let's get started first off with why you would want to do this in the first place. And once upon a time, years ago, when even used Cisco equipment was really expensive, and routers cost thousands of dollars, I would certainly understand why anyone would say, hey, I'm using a simulator, or, I'm using rack time. And most rack rental companies, unfortunately, really point their efforts toward CCIE candidates. They don't really want the business of the CCNAs and the CCNPs, and they price their equipment accordingly. But you need hands-on experience with the real thing to be a true CCNP, and I'll tell you why. And it sounds counterintuitive at first, but you do your best learning when something's not quite working the way it should. I've mentioned throughout this BSCI course that developing your analytical skills is really what this business is all about. And I think a lot of people really miss that point, especially when they go to the CCNP and they can't answer some of the questions on the exam, and they can't troubleshoot effectively in the real world production networks because they haven't developed those skills. And we've all seen people like that. You may have worked with them. I know that I have, where if something went wrong, they just really didn't know what to do except to call tech support. And that's not always an option. We've got to be able to figure it out. And in the exam room, I can guarantee you, you cannot call tech support, even though someone tried from the CCI lab one day. It wasn't me, but that's a story for another time. People try, but it just doesn't work out. Good. Well, with the simulators, and I don't mind hiding this, I'm not a fan of these things at all. they had their place at one point, but when I see people paying hundreds of dollars for software programs that are pretending to be routers and switches, you just don't learn from those things. I just don't see it, because when I've seen them, and I have seen recent ones, and I have people who have bought them who tell me this stuff too, everything's going to work perfectly. And as far as the little simulation goes, and it'll walk you through some steps, and that's okay, but you're not really learning how to configure it. You're not really learning how to troubleshoot it when it goes wrong. And that's the ability you have to develop to become a CCNP, and especially a CCIE. I mean, if you have any thought of being a CCIE one day, you need to get off of router simulator programs as fast as you can and start putting that money in some equipment. So, as you can see, I do get pretty animated about that, but I see it all the time. There's no reason to spend $150 on a router simulator when you can spend that money on real equipment, because used routers make putting together your own home lab more affordable than ever. And think about it this way: you're basically renting the equipment. Because let's say that you go to eBay and you find a vendor and you decide to invest $500. Well, I'm just pulling that value out of the air. You decide to spend $500 on Cisco routers and or switches. And you work with it for a couple of months and you get your certifications, and then you decide, okay, I'm going to look at doing something else now. I want to sell this. I'm not really using it. Let's say you get your CCNP and you're perfectly happy right there. Nothing wrong with that. So you say, well, you know, I'm not really using this equipment for anything now. Well, then you sell it again. You sell it. You either sell it on eBay yourself or find someone to sell it to on the net, or you can sell it right back to the company that sold it to you, because they're always happy to buy it back. Now, they're not going to buy it back in 100%, obviously. If you get half, you'd probably be fortunate. But let's say that you only got $200 for it, and that's an extreme case. You kept it for 6 months, got your CCNP, bought it for $500, sold it for $200. Well, basically what you did is you rented the equipment $300 for 6 months, $50 a month to rent the equipment you bought. That's a really good deal. You can't buy a cheap simulator program, I think, for $49.95, something like that. But meanwhile, you were working on the real thing and learning real skills. What I often say about when it comes to simulators, I always say this: look, the great chefs of the world do not learn how to cook on a kitchen simulator or on a stove simulator or an oven simulator. They're in there in cooking school, and they're ruining a lot of meals, right? I mean, when you're learning to cook, and I've been there too, you're burning stuff. But that's the thing. I mean, you do that on your home lab, and it's a big deal. If you just can't resolve something, you end up just doing a right erase and starting over again and tackling it again until you get it right. And it's the experience of burning those meals or writing the configs that didn't quite work out, but then you made them work. You build confidence, and that's the skill you build on to advance your career. I mean, we're talking about your career here. It's not a game. And you don't want to hand that over to a software program when you can work with the real thing so easily. Now, before we get into more details with that, and yes, I do get animated about this, I want you to put your hands on real Cisco equipment and become a real Cisco engineer. I want to shake your hand one day and congratulate you on your CCIE or your CCNP. If you want to stop there, that's fine. But a CCNP who has never touched a real router or a switch, I don't know. You don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. We'll leave that for other people. One thing before we get into a discussion about models and that kind of thing, though, I get this question a lot from CCNP candidates such as yourself, and they'll write to me and say, well, you know, I want to buy some home lab equipment. I think it's a great idea, but I want to make sure I can use it for the CCIE. I'm telling you from personal experience, don't even worry about that. I'm going to discuss CCIE lab equipment later in this video as well. But I want to tell you, I don't really think it's a good idea to invest a lot of money in your own CCIE home lab. And the problem there is that with CCNA and CCNP, the topics do not change rapidly. And when they do, you know, OSPF is OSPF. But with the CCNP lab, you have to be careful about buying equipment for that, because the equipment list can change dramatically, and they overhaul that twice a year. And I'll tell you a true story happened to me. I bought some equipment for the CCNP, and it included a Catalyst 5000 switch, which was not cheap at the time. This was several years ago. And then all of a sudden they changed over, took that switch out, and put in two 3550 switches, which brand new cost $5,000 to $6,000 a piece. So I was then faced with a choice of, okay, do I want to spend $12,000 on two switches for my home lab, or do I want to start renting equipment? Well, about that time, rack rentals started getting fairly affordable, so that's the road I went. I did not buy the switches, and I did earn my CCIE. So you have to be careful with that, with worrying about, you know, okay, I'm going to spend a lot of money so I can use them on my IE practice. eBay is a great place to start learning about home labs. You know, what's out there, what routers are out there, what are the prices. And you will see a lot of vendors with pre-assembled router kits. And those can be a good deal. I've seen some good ones out there. And what I mean by kit, they'll say, okay, we've got one switch here, we've got 3 routers, here are all the cables you'll need, here are all the transceivers you'll need, here's a copy of the config you'll need if there's an access server in there. Everything in one kit. And I've seen some good values with those. But what you want to watch out for, as I mentioned here on the third part of the whiteboard, is that you want to watch out for kits that include books, because a lot of times they're outdated. And if the books are in there and you don't need them, and I've seen some with like 3 CCNA books. CCNA kits seem to be real big on this. I haven't seen as much of this with CCNP. And if you don't want the books, if you've already got the books or you got my course, you don't need any books, right? But if you don't want any more books with your kit, just email the vendor and say, look, I'm really interested in buying this, but I don't want the books. And if he thinks he's got a sale, he's going to give you a better price without the books. If he just says no, then go find someone else to buy from. Because that's the other great thing about putting together a home lab now, is that there are a lot of reputable companies and reputable individuals who do nothing but specialize in reselling Cisco used hardware. So if you have a problem with any of the equipment, which does happen on occasion, but it's really rare. I mean, I personally have spent at least $80,000 on used Cisco equipment in the last couple of years in running this business. And I would say less than 0.1% of the equipment I bought I've had any trouble with. But I bought the equipment from reputable companies. They were power sellers on eBay. That's something else to look for, because it means they're doing a certain volume every month. And they replaced the equipment immediately. You have to be careful on eBay buying equipment from individuals who don't make a living, or at least don't regularly sell eBay Cisco equipment. You have to be a little careful about that. I'm not saying it's always a bad idea, but just be careful. What a lot of people do with eBay now, and actually this is true of my website as well, people will see my ads on eBay, but then they'll come out to the website and actually make a purchase there. If a vendor doesn't have a website, that's a little strange today. In today's day and age, I do see that on occasion. If I ask for the website, they don't have one. I tend not to buy from people like that, because if they're really selling a lot of stuff, they're going to have their own website. And I like to visit the website, read a little bit about the company, look for testimonials, and that kind of thing. It just gives you a little better feeling about it. But again, there are a lot of very reputable companies out there now that sell used Cisco routers and Cisco kits. So again, with the kits, just watch the books. Don't buy anything you don't need. When we look at models, occasionally I just crack up when I see some of the CCNA boot camps or CCNP boot camps out there. And one of the reasons I laugh is like, well, we don't use any of those 2,500 or 2,600 routers. We use 3,600 routers here. Well, that's great for them. But frankly, for a CCNA, and I know you're working on your CCNP, for your CCNP study, 2,500s are perfectly acceptable. I mean, OSPF is OSPF. BGP is BGP. You do not need top-of-the-line routers for CCNP study. 2600 is fantastic. If you want to go up a series, that's fine. But again, every single course that I teach, every single video you've seen in this course, which I think you'll agree is very comprehensive, every single one of them except IS to IS I ran on 2500 routers. The IS to IS does require a special internetwork operating system in Enterprise iOS, and it's hard to get some of those on 2500s. But the deal is with that is that IS to IS is now gone from the CCIE routing and switching lab, and it's really being de-emphasized in the CCNP. I wouldn't be surprised to see it gone in another 6 or 12 months. I really wouldn't be. You saw that when we did the IS to IS video in this course, we went way beyond what you're going to see on the BSCI. The BSCI exam is very heavy on IS to IS theory and the basic commands, and that's it. So if you want to run IS to IS in your home lab, be aware that you do need a special version of the Internet Network Operating System. You can always email the vendor and say, can I run IS to IS on your routers? If you can, they'll probably tell you that in their post. But again, 2500s, there's nothing wrong with them. And you'll find that they're very affordable. I mean, you're looking anywhere from 80 to maybe 175 a piece, depending on what you're buying. And for access servers, and if you don't know what an access server is, I'm going to fill you in on that in just a second too. But for those of you who know what they are, stick to the 2500 series. You can go out to eBay and type in access server, and you'll see some routers that cost $9,000. You do not need a $9,000 access server for a home lab. You need a $100 or $150 access server. Maybe 175. They go as high as that. But you do not need anything fancy for an access server. Not necessary. Let's talk about what I use in my racks then for just a few minutes. In the racks that you saw in this course, I use 2520s and I do use 2501s for router 3 only, because the only interfaces that I needed on that router 3 were a couple of serial interfaces and an Ethernet port. And that's all those have. They don't have any BRI ports or anything like that. For CCNP study, you can look at the other CCNP exams, make up your own mind about what you need. You might not need ISDN ports, BRI ports. But you might want them for the remote access. That's really up to you. But 2520s also make great frame relay switches. And let's take a look right now. We'll come back to this, but I mentioned about access servers. What is an access server and where does a frame relay switch go? An access server is not mandatory, but it's not a bad idea. Because let's say that you've got 3 routers in your home lab. And I know that routers are round, but this is the back of them. Okay? I know that in documentation, routers are round, but this is the way they look in a rack. So here's your PC over here. And, to connect to these directly, and you remember this from your CCNP work, you have to have a rollover cable. And what you've got to do is connect this from your PC. I'll even make it blue just like they really are. You've got to connect that to the console port of your router and configure that. You go through HyperTerminal or whatever terminal emulation program you want to run, and that's fine. But the problem is you're going to get a little tired of continually moving that cable around. You are going to get very tired of that. I've been there. And, when you're done configuring this router, then you got to get up, unless it's right in front of you, and then go over and say, okay, let's plug it into this router, and then let's plug it into this router. You've got to continually move that cable around. And what you can do is buy an intermediate device called an access server. And just to show you, I don't mind telling stories on myself. When I first heard of access server, I thought it was like something Microsoft made. Because it's it's server. Cisco doesn't make servers. Well, this is called an access server, but what it actually is a Cisco router. And it's a Cisco router with a large number of asynchronous ports. And it's going to have 2 connectors on the back, or maybe just one, or asynchronous lines, I should say. And you need a special cable to use an access server, but here's the beauty of it. What you do with an access server is connect your PC to the access server. I'll try to shorten that line up. You connect your PC to the access server, and then the access server will be connected to each one of these routers' console ports with something we call an octal cable. And we call it an octal cable because it's got 8 connections on it. It looks like it's got a giant serial connector on one end and then 8 individual RJ45 connectors on the other side. And in this way, with your PC here, you put a simple little configuration on the access server, and all you ever do is connect directly to the access server. And you set up what we call reverse telnet from the access server to the other routers. And again, you may not be familiar with reverse telnet. If you're not, I'm going to show you where to read up on it. It's very simple, and you never have to remove it once it's working. Until you add more routers and switches, then you got to add 1 or 2 lines. But it's a very simple configuration. I'll even show you a good place to locate a configuration for an access server, and it will just save you a load of time. It really will. When you get one, you just think, how did I ever do without this? Again, it's not mandatory, but once you get a lab of 3 routers or more, you're going to want to get one. And again, for an access server, if you can find them, you know, they're not always that easy to find. The ones I have in my pods right now actually came from Spain because I had to change the power supply. You know, it's different. It's different than the United States uses. So if you can find a 2509 or a 2511, that's fine. You can do a search on eBay to find other access server models. I actually find it easier to go to eBay and look for router models than I do to go out to Cisco. Because with Cisco, you got to wade through all the documentation. With eBay, whoever's trying to sell it to you has it right in front of you. So if you ever wonder about, you know, you hear about a 2507 router, and you think, I wonder what ports that has, you're probably better off just going to eBay and searching for it and than trying to find it on Cisco.com. But that is what an access server does. Now let's take a look at what a frame switch does. And we didn't configure frame relay here in the BSCI, but the routers 1, 2, and 3 were communicating over frame relay cloud. And you can actually configure your own frame relay cloud on a Cisco router by configuring it as a frame relay switch. If you don't know how to do that, I'm going to also tell you where you can find a frame relay switch config, because with frame relay switching, sometimes the hardest part is getting the initial configuration to work, but it's also just finding something on the net that says, here's how to configure a frame relay switch. So I'm going to tell you exactly where you can find something like that. With a frame relay switch, what you end up doing is connecting the frame relay switch to each one of the routers, and it's got to be at one of their serial interfaces. And this is actually how you simulate a frame relay cloud in a home lab. Routers 1, 2, and 3 in my pods are not directly connected at serial 0. They're connected to the frame relay switch. And the frame relay switch, remember what it's configured as? Remember what it's going to be? It's going to be configured as a DCE on those interfaces. And again, it's frame relay switch is the name of the device, but it is a Cisco router, or it can be. And a couple of models, I'll give you 2 here. 2520s make great frame relay switches. 4000s do too. Now they're a little loud, or they were the last time I bought one. It's been a little while. So I'm not sure what the availability of 4000 routers is, but 2520s you can find. And what you're looking for in a frame relay switch is as many serial interfaces as you can get. And the 2520s have 4 of them, which is plenty for this particular setup. And in this way, you actually can simulate a frame relay cloud. You've got a working frame relay cloud right there in your home lab. And it's great stuff for both the CCNA and the CCNP, because you need that frame relay cloud to practice a lot of the OSPF configurations that we went through. So again, if you're looking at a frame relay switch in an access server, those devices are not mandatory, but they're great to have. And I'll tell you something else, and you may have noticed this when we went through some of the configurations. In my pods, this frame relay switch was also router 4. Router 4 in our pods is also acting as a frame relay switch, because you can configure a 2520 or another Cisco router to do frame relay switching on some ports, but you can still use the other serial interfaces or Ethernet interfaces for routing. Matter of fact, let's bring that up here. This router 4 that I've got, this is actually performing frame relay switching. And I'm going to do a quick write on it so we can see the latest configuration. But this is another great use for a 2520, because you can configure it as a frame relay switch and actually use it as one of your production routers in your lab. So let's take a look. This is a quick show config. You see right up here at the top, here's the command that makes it all happen. Frame relay switching. You configure that on your router, and it's now a frame relay switch. But you do not have to do that on every interface. Because see, we were using this Ethernet interface that you see right there. We used that throughout the course. Interface serial 0, we were using that at shutdown now, but we used that a couple of times to connect directly to router 3. And you see here on serial 1, 2, and 3 that these are the interfaces that are actually doing the frame relay switching. They don't have IP addresses. They do have a clock rate. They're configured as a DCE interface. And you have a couple of frame relay route statements. If those look a little foreign to you, don't worry about it. Again, I'll show you a website that has all this stuff in one place. And that's it. But this one also happened to have a BRI interface. We didn't use it, but you saw us throughout the course run every single routing protocol on it with no trouble at all. The kind of cable you need here, though, and we'll discuss cables here for a moment, you do need DTE DCE cables. Every one of these connections would be a DTE DCE cable. They're remarkably cheap now. They're about $10 a piece, I think. When I put my CCIE lab together, they used to cost like $150, and they were 30 feet long. Looked like you had this huge blue snake curled up in the corner because you had two routers that were 6 inches apart, connected with a 30-foot cable. Because, hey, as the man said, that's what we had back then. So your access server here, the kind of cable you're looking at is called an octal cable. Oftentimes they will come with an access server purchase, but make sure if you need one, you can find those on eBay as well. You can find vendors who sell those. And the octal cable, again, it's got one serial connector on one end. It's going to connect to the asynchronous lines on your access server, and then your individual RJ45 connectors on the other side of the cable will connect to the routers. Great stuff to have. I do mention a couple of other things here that you may need, depending on what you buy. You're going to need a rollover cable in there somewhere because you got to connect directly sometime. And you will need one of those. They often come with used routers too. A lot of times you get routers, you'll get a rollover cable with a used router. You'll need some straight through cables because for the connections in this network, the 2500 routers have AUI ports. They do not have Ethernet ports. So what you actually need is a transceiver. You've probably seen one. It looks like a little black box, fits right in the palm of your hand. And you simply connect one end of the straight through cable into the RJ45 connector on it, and then the other side of it just connects directly to the router. Transceivers cost about $10 too. And you only need them if you have AUI ports on your routers instead of pure Ethernet. And if you want to see the difference between AUI and Ethernet, do a search engine search on that, and you'll see why you need the transceiver. But again, they're about $10 a piece. You'll need some straight through cables. If you have multiple switches, if you're fortunate enough to have that situation, if you're going to connect two switches for trunking, keep in mind that you will need some crossover cables. Because 2950 switches like the ones I have in my pods are becoming more and more popular. But if you put a straight through cable in between them, you're going to sit there for a long time and wait for that trunk line to form. It's not going to happen. So we looked at an access server here. Again, specialty device, but you'll be glad you had it. And you'll be able to get good value when you sell that as well, if you choose to down the road. Frame relay switch, took a look at that. I want to mention one other thing before we even look at renting equipment, and that's an ISDN simulator. And I'm not real sure you need one for the CCNP exams. If you want to do some for remote access, that's fine. That's more of a CCNA thing. But the key there is that those are coming down in price because they've been taken off the CCIE lab. And although I think they're being a little hasty because there is still a lot of ISDN out there in small to medium-sized networks, they're de-emphasizing that in their other exams as well, from what I've heard and seen. So that's something you can kind of do without now. If I had the choice between spending the money for a simulator or getting an access server and a frame relay switch, I'd get the access server and the frame relay switch in a heartbeat. Because simulators are still expensive. They're durable. The one that I have in one of my pods, I've had for 6 years and never had a bit of trouble with it. I definitely wouldn't get what I paid for it if I sold it, so I've kept it, and it works perfectly fine. New ones can cost, $1,500. They have plenty of used ones on eBay that cost much less than that, but I can't vouch for how durable they are. Some of them, like I said, the one I've had is fine. But that's the other thing about Cisco routers. I mean, when you buy these used ones, the devices are so robust that I have very rarely had a problem with a used router. Well, let's talk about renting equipment. And again, I want to give you a little disclaimer here. I do rent pods like the one we've used here in this course to CCNA and CCNP candidates. I am not getting rich off of it, but I do it. So I just want you to know that before we have this discussion. And hey, sometimes you just can't make the investment yet. That's why I keep the price as low as I can on my site, because to allow people to get as much hands-on experience as they can. And for larger labs, I mean, let's face it, I've got 7 routers and 2 switches per pod, and that's a lot of devices because you got router 1, 2, 3, you got the frame relay switch, you've got the access server, so that's 5 routers, excuse me, and I keep 2 2950 switches in every single one of my pods, and I'm going to be upgrading those to 3500s for CCNP candidates over the next few months. So to run a larger lab, maybe you don't have that much equipment, and you don't have to have that much to get started. You may want to consider renting equipment. Most CCIE lab vendors may be a little pricey for you, mainly because the pods are so big and they have to have the latest and the greatest. So it's not just they're expensive because they're trying to stick you, they're expensive because they have made quite an investment in equipment. And also, you may want to rent equipment just to get access to equipment that you just don't happen to have in your lab. If you needed ISDN practice, you'd probably be better off renting time from me than going out and buying, $1,000 worth of equipment or a $600 simulator, ISDN simulator, to get that done. If you don't know what an ISDN simulator is, by the way, it's a device that it's an actual physical device that simulates the telephone company in your network. It's not a software program. Don't confuse it with a router simulator. Also with 3500s, because they've come down in price, thank goodness, from $6,000 a piece. But still, used ones cost about $1,500. And I'll be adding those to my pods over the next few months. I'm going to put one in each pod for advanced switching students to get access to, because you got to know how to use the 3500. And I tell you, those switches are fantastic. You need experience on a layer 3 switch. So that actually should say 3550. So for equipment that's a little pricey, I could certainly understand, as much as I love home lab stuff, that you don't want to spend $1,500 on a switch that you really need for one exam. I understand that. So you may want to look around. Don't if you can't get it at my site, maybe there are some other sites out there you could look at renting some equipment. All of the CCIE lab vendors have to have those switches in there because the lab still has two. So that's pretty close to it as far as renting the equipment. Here is here's the setup that I use in my pods, just to give you some ideas. The access server, and the other great thing about the access server is that you can set that up so you can telnet into your own pod. You know, whether it's from work, when nobody's looking, or when you're on vacation, whatever you want to do. I know you don't want to go back to it when you're on vacation. But if you get a static IP address and put it on your access server, you can telnet to your equipment, and you can have access to everything behind it. And you can't beat that. So I use 2520s for routers 1 and 2 and the frame relay switch. And I do use a 2501 for an R3. Now, when you reboot those, the R3 is going to lag behind the 2501 is going to lag a little bit. That is definitely not latest and the greatest, but it's still perfectly usable. And for my switches, I do use 2950s. But that's really up to you. If you choose to buy switches and you choose to buy 1900s, make sure you get one with an iOS. Because I thought for a long time the ones I worked on didn't have iOSs, but I understand that some of them do. So just make sure that you get something with an iOS. You do not want a menu-driven switch. Of course, if you just want a switch and you don't want a Cisco switch, you can always pick one up at your local computer store for very little money. Just depends on where you want to spend the money. So I hope you found this video really helpful. I do feel, as someone who has studied for certifications without access to the equipment and someone who's studied for them with the access, that working on the real thing, there's nothing like it. I'm not sitting here bashing so-called paper CCNAs or CCNPs. I don't get into that argument. I think it's silly. But, you know, because we're all starting somewhere. We're all at some point where we've still got work left to do. And the real key, though, is a lot of these simulators out here, you can't run debugs on them. They don't act like real routers and switches. And to develop the troubleshooting and the analytical skills that you need to be a real professional, to be able to troubleshoot networks, to be able to go on and pass, you know, the CCIE lab if that's where you've got your eye on. And I hope you do. I think it's a very worthwhile accomplishment and definitely something worth working toward. You got to work on the real thing. And I hope you found this video helpful in that. And I do want to refer you, I'd mentioned a couple of times that there was one site you could go to that had all this information in one place. And frankly, it is mine. I have made a point of creating a special home lab help section on the website. And occasionally I may change the name. I may change the name of the page, so I don't want to give you the full navigation to it. And then when you buy this, it doesn't work. Go to the main page, and I've got a home lab help section. And that has a lot of articles in it. It discusses in more depth, perhaps, some of the things we've touched on here. So it does help you with articles regarding what to buy, what to look out for, that kind of thing. There is a access server configuration on that site. So if you decide to purchase an access server and you have a little trouble setting it up, you can look at mine. You can copy mine. You just need to change the IP addresses, and it'll work for you perfectly fine. It'll save you a lot of trouble. One of the most popular, actually the most popular page on the website, I think, is the frame relay switch configuration page. Because I do have one of those as well. That can be really frustrating the first time you set it up, because you've got incoming DLCs and outgoing DLCs, and when you're trying to set that up on a Cisco router, at least on a 2520, the iOS help is not that helpful. It leaves a little to be desired. So I do have right there for you a frame relay switch configuration that you're welcome to copy and use, as long as you use the same DLCs on your routers that I have in the switch configuration. That'll be fine. I've got some free tutorials and other things out there for you to look at. I've got a lot of free information on the site, but I do recommend that if you are, if you're looking at even investing a little bit in your home lab, if you're looking at adding to it or just don't know where to start, visit that section of the website, and it will really help you out. And if after reading the articles, and I do say after reading the articles, if you've got any questions on home lab equipment or anything really to do with your CCNP studies, I'm glad to help. I mean, that's what I'm here for. I'm here for you. And you can always email me right there at chris@thebryantadvantage.com. I can't promise I'll be back to you in 10 minutes, but I will be back to you. Because I know, and again from experience, because I've been right where you are. You know, I've been there where you want to start putting the equipment together and you don't know what to buy and you think, oh, I don't want to get stuck with this stuff. Well, you're not going to get stuck with it. Read my articles on the website. Read the Home Lab Help section. Look at eBay. Find some reputable vendors. Ask them questions. I mean, you don't have to buy something the first time you go there or the first time you see a site. If you've got a question about a piece of equipment, write to them and ask. Because if they don't answer you, then you didn't want to buy anything from them in the first place. But I've never had anybody not get back to me that was a reputable seller. This investment, as someone who has gone from CCNA to CCNP to CCIE, I can tell you the single best thing I ever did along the path was put my own home lab together. And I have seen this work for people at the CCNA level and the CCNP level who are stuck. And I'm not saying that you're stuck, but they couldn't quite get past a certain point, and they bought a couple of routers. They started working with the stuff. They got over what I call router anxiety. You know, it's the anxiety of buying your first equipment. And I tell you, they add hundreds of points to their exam score. And if the home lab can't be a reality for you right now, consider renting some rack time before you hit the exam. And like I said, write to me if you got any questions about the home lab. I'll be glad to help you out.